Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Successfully Selling Safety Throughout Your Fleet, presented by SmartDrive. I'm Lauren Fletcher, Executive Editor of Work Truck Magazine, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. I encourage you to ask questions during the webinar at any point, and we will try to address them all. However, if we do not get to yours, don't worry. You will be contacted by email with a response after the event. Our presenter today is Don Osterberg, a consultant with SmartDrive. Don formerly served as Senior VP of Safety, Security, and Driver Training for Schneider. His distinguished career in commercial transportation spans several decades, and he is a recognized authority on carrier safety, having held leadership roles with organizations including the NSC, FMCSA Motor Carrier Safety Advisory Committee, ATA's Safety Policy Committee, and ATRI's Research Advisory Committee. Don is also a retired airborne and Ranger qualified U.S. Army infantry colonel. Now, I'll hand it over to Don.
Thank you, Lauren, for the kind introduction, and good morning or good afternoon to the audience, depending on the time zone that you're in. We're going to discuss a critical challenge that we collectively face as an industry. I'm confident that most of you recognize that there's been a dramatic increase in truck-involved fatalities and truck-involved injuries over the past decade. Specifically, just to put that in context, in the economic recession-aided performance in 2009, which was the safest year in our industry, truck-involved fatalities have gone up 48% through 2018, the last year that we have credible numbers on. Truck-involved injuries have gone up during that same time frame over 100%. And when you think about the backdrop of improved occupant protection in automobiles and improved active technologies in both automobiles and trucks, that certainly is an alarming negative trend that really creates an obligation for us as transportation professionals to do more and to be better, in fact, be much better. So today we're going to talk about how to sell safety within your company. We'll talk about some pragmatic tools that you can use from a communication perspective, but we're going to spend some time talking about your organizational culture, because really that's where we have to start, is to create and lead a true culture of safety and even beyond. And we'll talk mostly through the lens of safety today, but it's important that as we look at our culture and assess that holistically, safety is an important element of our culture, but there's a number of threads that are woven together to create the whole of what is referred to as organizational culture. Jim Collins, many of you will recall, in his book Good to Great, talked about the imperative for companies to create a culture of discipline as well. And I would add, it's important that organizations, I think especially today, embrace a culture of change in which we demand change within our organization rather than simply tolerate it. We'll spend some time talking about the power of our individual and collective beliefs, because they really are at the core of our culture. And the challenge of selling change of any kind requires us oftentimes to change our beliefs or to communicate our beliefs better. And certainly when we're talking about the challenge associated with change, we're experiencing massive changes right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. Really unprecedented in many ways, and it's really created or exacerbated the environment that we've always worked in, which could be best characterized as being volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to first talk about the challenge of change, and there's a formula that I was exposed to a while back, and I'll explain it. Q times A equals E. And really what we're talking about here is when we think about affecting change or influencing change within our respective organizations, change includes both two components. One, change management, and the other, change leadership. And that's really represented in this formula. Q is the quality of either your idea, your proposal, a technology perhaps that you're contemplating fielding within your fleet. And that really is the change management. It's the concept and it's the planning and execution of that change, times the A, which is the acceptance. And ensuring that people accept the change within your organization is at the core of change leadership. And then, of course, E is the effectiveness of that change. And so we're going to talk about the importance of leading through uncertainty and leading through these times of dramatic change. And one of the things that I've learned is that midway through any meaningful change feels an awful lot like failure. So as leaders, we have to have a vision, that is very vivid for our people. And we put words together to portray that vision because people are drawn to the vision. The leader with our words can release the energy and passion within our organization. And in the spirit of words matter, one of the things that we often had fun with at Schneider is that I often talked about the fact that hope is not a strategy. It's neither, it isn't a tactic, it isn't a method, it isn't a plan. And oftentimes as leaders, that word hope, we hope for a certain outcome comes in. Well, if you think about that, if we're relying on hope, we're probably in trouble. And I was told many years ago when I was a student at the Army War College by a career State Department employee that words matter. So challenge yourself when you're speaking to people to, one, not use the word hope. In fact, we had what we called a hope jar at Schneider, where if somebody in a meeting would use the word hope, we would have them throw in a quarter or a dollar that we would spend on a team building exercise later. But it sounds a little bit silly, but choose words carefully when we're communicating change to the organization, because people will really hang on every word. And so I would encourage you to change the word hope with the word expect. This is the outcome we expect, and to be able to communicate that with passion and enthusiasm. And moving right along, I mentioned we're going to talk about culture. And the definition that I use for culture is a set of shared beliefs, attitudes, and values, or goals and practices that characterize a company. And I think the key words in that definition are beliefs and values, and we'll talk about that. But as I mentioned before, setting the company culture by creating shared beliefs is a senior leader accountability. But whether we're the CEO or whether we're a manager in the organization or whether we're a driver, we all have the ability and the obligation to influence change, to influence the culture within our organization. And we'll talk in a minute about values and priorities and how they differ. Priorities change. Priorities typically are situational, whereas values tend to be enduring. So many of you have an espoused value of safety, for example, first and always, or safety 24/7, safety 365. Our employees or our drivers are our most precious resource. Those are espoused values. We have to make sure, and they're critically important because they provide guidance to our people about how to reconcile the tension between the competing demands that they face every day. But our challenge is to make sure that there's congruence between our espoused values, which is what we say, and our enacted values, which is what we do, because not only our drivers, but our frontline leaders will do an acid test of our core values to see whether or not what we say and what we do match. Critically important. Back to the theme of words matter. And switching gears just a little bit, I talked about the importance of our individual and collective beliefs. And my guess is that there's undoubtedly some safety managers who are on the call today. And most safety managers have been educated to manage behaviors. It's really a focus. If you think about safety, it's about the avoidance of negative outcomes. We tend to focus on the negative outcomes. And we recognize that we have to address behaviors. And while that's true, if you accept the premise that our behaviors are an outcome, they're an outcome of our beliefs, and if we want to address any issues that we have at the root level, we need to address it at the belief level. And it used to be that success and safety flowed to carriers who would react to an incident with some type of remediation such that there wouldn't be a recurrence of that type of an incident. Well, today we have the luxury of not only data, but we also have active safety technologies that really have changed how we define success. And success flows to those who can detect problematic behavior before a crash or incident occurs and take action so that it never occurs. and it's the early near-miss detection of behaviors is critical. So I don't want to suggest by behaviors not being at the root that we can ignore behavior-based safety management. But what I believe as leaders and our challenge is to address our organizational beliefs as really step one and transition from behavior-based safety management to belief-based safety leadership. We manage processes, we manage data, but ultimately we lead people, which will be the guarantor of our success or our failure. So let's switch gears and talk just a little bit about selling safety to executives. This slide, I got a call a few years back from a gentleman who asked if I would be willing to give the keynote address at TIDA's annual meeting. I didn't at the time, frankly, know what TIDA stood for, but it's the Trucking Industry Defense Association. And I agreed to do that, but I was asked to give an update on our industry, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I said, well, what part of our industry do you want me to update? Do you want me to tell you what the good guys are doing, or do you want me to tell you what the bad guys aren't doing? And so the thought began to emerge in my mind of what's the difference? Characteristically, what's the difference between kind of the carriers with a strong culture and those perhaps with a weak culture? So I'll let you kind of take a look at what I included as those characterizations. Zero fatalities is the goal for strong carriers or carriers with strong culture. Some view fatality, crashes, God forbid, in our industry as a cost of doing business. In good carriers, safety is a core value. In good carriers, they're emotionally connected empathically to the cost of failure in our industry, which is often serious injuries sustained and fatalities. That's the reality of 80,000-pound trucks and 3,000-pound cars. Generally, in my experience, the stronger carriers view safety through a moral lens and not through a financial lens, although I'll tell you in a minute, it doesn't really matter which lens you look at it through because it'll take you to the same place. And probably the biggest thing is strong carriers are proactive. For those who take comfort in the fact that because FMCSA hasn't mandated a particular technology or a particular program, that they're not obligated to do that. The one thing I learned, I did serve on the Motor Carrier Safety Advisory Committee for FMCSA and have some dear friends in that organization, but I think they would agree with me when I say that innovators will lead regulators every time. So there's certainly no need to wait for regulators to mandate certain things, and we'll talk more in a minute about why that is. So I talked a little bit about viewing safety through a moral lens. And I think it's essential that we understand, as I mentioned before, that as transportation professionals, we have a moral obligation to the motoring public with whom we share our workplace to be as safe as we can be. And in many ways, that comes down moralistically to doing the right things. And only you can introspectively challenge yourselves and your company as to whether or not you're doing the right things. It's also important that we do the right things right, which are two very different things. But I think you'll agree, and we're certainly seeing it here in the past few weeks, that the essentiality of commercial transportation has never been more evident to the public than it is right now in terms of the efforts that are going on to make sure that supplies get to where they're needed, even with this fear of pandemic in place. And we had a credo at Schneider that I loved for its simplicity, and it really spoke to our number one core value of safety first and always. And it was very simply this, is that nothing that we do, albeit important, the work that we do, but nothing we do is worth harming ourselves or others. And if we can cause our people to believe that, their behaviors will follow that belief. And when there is potential tension between the competing demands of safety and, say, productivity, which is a proxy for profitability, or safety and service in this service-sensitive economy that we're in right now, it provides guidance to people that we reconcile that tension in the name of safety, which is the right thing to do. So one of the things that I would suggest being important, and I probably will take a shot at some accountants here, and I will exaggerate to make the point, but I think that we have to modify the way we think about return on investment thresholds for investments. And that safety really has to take a category of its own. So you may have an arbitrary or maybe it's a thoughtful threshold of a 40% return on invested capital for any intervention that you may be contemplating. In my view, with safety being so critical, if we have reasonable confidence that we can cover the cost of capital that it takes to invest in the intervention, the technology, the program, whatever it may be, you default to yes, because the downside is limited and the upside is significant. So I'm not suggesting that we get a free pass on the ROI calculations for safety, but when in doubt, and the reality of these days is capital is nearly free. So when you think about the confidence that we have in our ability to cover the cost of capital, it perhaps changes the lens through which you look at a safety investment. And I won't spend a tremendous amount of time on this slide. I put this together a while back. And one of the things that I asked a critical question is, what percent of every risk and safety dollar that we spend is spent on what we would consider pure prevention versus settlements when we fail, so claim settlement? And I would guess that if I were to ask the carrier representatives on the call today, what percentage of your total risk spend, which would include insurance premiums as well, is on prevention versus claim settlement, you probably don't know, because it's very likely that you haven't asked and answered that question. So if you do ask that question, and there are some assumptions that you have to make in calculating what are our prevention dollars and what are claim settlement and insurance dollars, but it's certainly not that difficult to do, you may well be surprised at what you find. And generally speaking, this is a generalization that would be difficult for me to prove across the industry. But in the industry, generally speaking, about 15 to 20% is spent on pure prevention, and the balance is spent on settling claims and paying insurance. And I don't think any thinking leader would draw the line between prevention spend and claim settlement where it often is with carriers because of the moral obligation that we talked about. And when you think about the rapidly escalating costs in post-crash litigation with nuclear verdicts and with skyrocketing insurance premiums, I think you'll agree that we have to shift that line, if you will, more toward prevention so that we can spend less on claim settlement. And I don't believe for a second, there are some who say, well, meaningful tort reform worked in the area of medical malpractice, and we have to wait for meaningful tort reform in the trucking industry. And I would encourage you to not wait, because I don't believe for a second that meaningful tort reform is on the horizon. It may happen at some point, but it certainly hasn't happened yet, and it likely won't for quite some time. So let's talk about that situation in the litigation that is really front of mind almost every day. I, like you, read of another carrier who has shuttered their doors because of a nuclear verdict or the fact that they can't afford the insurance. And the environment certainly has changed, and there's a lot of different threads that you could pull on to define that change. But one of the big ones, I think, goes largely unnoticed or under the kind of the radar. And that's, I used to say years ago in preparation for deposition and post-crash litigation that you really had to be prepared to answer three questions. And it was, what did you know? When did you know it? And what did you do about it? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. The complexity that's now added to that is the risk in post-crash litigation is what did you know or what could you have known? When did you know it or when could you have known it? Or what did you do or what could you have done? I just lost my, okay, now I think we're back. And hopefully that didn't disrupt on your end. And when the difference in those sentences, it seems subtly different with the word could. But what I've found, and I will put it kind of into layman's terms so attorneys won't recognize the language I'm using, is that a path to punitive damages, which is what the plaintiff's attorneys are often after, they have to prove one of two conditions. That one, you're either indifferent to the safety implications of the choices you make. In other words, you're putting company profitability ahead of safety. or you're incompetent to manage or lead safety, which is the requirement of people in the positions that many of us are in. And they don't care whether they prove incompetence or indifference, because either one is a path to punitive damages. So, the deposition, I'm sure many of you have been deposed many times in the past, is, Mr. Osterberg, were you aware when the scenario of the incident of the crash is articulated, are you aware that other carriers have made investments in safety technology, safety programs, and other things that have demonstrated significant improvements? If you acknowledge that you're not aware of that, they will color you as incompetent. If you acknowledge that you are aware of it, they may color you as indifferent, because in spite of the fact that you know that there are proven technologies and programs out there, you simply chose to perhaps do nothing, which really in this environment creates kind of an indefensible position to be in. So there's a host of other reasons for the litigation environment, but I think you get the gist of kind of what has happened for a host of reasons and how we can best. And action is really the antidote for anxiety in this space with nuclear verdicts and skyrocketing insurance premiums. So I want to switch gears just a little bit for a few minutes and talk about selling safety to company leaders. We've talked about it. I want to spend a few minutes talking about other company leaders. I'm sure many of you have observed, as I did, that driver leaders and dispatchers tend to be task saturated. And so we have to convince them that whatever initiative we're contemplating will reduce and not worsen their already hectic work life, and that by focusing on prevention, we'll actually save drivers. So when we look through the lens of our driver capacity and the challenge of recruiting drivers in this environment, to the extent that we can decrease that churn due to safety issues because we identify those early, that it's a solid investment in our time. And focusing more time on leading or coaching is better than time spent investigating failure and putting drivers through either training or some type of progressive discipline. So when you're thinking about communicating with a task-saturated group, the last thing you want to do is to say, I'm going to add another rock to your rucksack for you to carry, but to say in time, the efficacy of this initiative that we're contemplating is actually going to reduce your workload, not worsen it. So we'll switch gears now to a critical element, and that's really selling safety to drivers. And I had a boss many years ago who had what he called the Great American Rule. It was this credo. And the essence of the Great American Rule was that when professionals disagree, and let's face it, we will from time to time, but generally speaking, when we disagree, it's because you know something I don't know, I know something you don't know, or something got lost or garbled in our communication. And at its essence, most of our disagreements are normally communications breakdowns and really not philosophical differences. And I can tell you, I had many, many conversations with drivers. And once we leveled the playing field with what they knew that I didn't know and what I knew that they didn't know, we were in agreement almost all the time. And I would end the conversation with a driver about, if you were me, in light of what we just talked about, what would you do? And generally speaking, the drivers responded with, I would do exactly what you did. So selling safety to drivers, this is motherhood and apple pie to most of you, but we do have to unclog the lines of communications. Drivers sit behind the wheel for hours every day. Small issues can fester into bigger issues, and they will fill in the blanks of what you have not communicated to them with what they think, which is frequently wrong. The other thing as it relates to drivers is I found out that it's important to engage the drivers in not just problem identification and re-communicating in subtly different ways the nature of the problem, but to quickly transition from storytelling and war storytelling to solutions and putting the pen in their hand about, okay, how should we think about a solution to whatever problem that we're collectively facing? Critically important in our communication, and I think you already know this, is not just communicating the what, but also communicating the why to what we are doing. And ask, as I mentioned before, if you were me, what would you do in light of what we've talked about? And Oftentimes, I caution against using emotion. I've often said that emotion can at times cloud your judgment. I think safety is the exception to that rule, in that we want to play the emotion card. And generally speaking, the professional drivers with whom I've interacted with over the years are very committed to the safety obligation that they have as a transportation professional. In playing the emotion card and exposing them to a family that has been devastated by the loss of a loved one or someone who has suffered a serious injury, you can quickly get them to drop their guard and to really connect with the message that you're trying to communicate with them. So I'm going to play a video here in a minute, but we discussed a minute ago about the importance of what did you know or what could you have known. And I talked a little bit about the deposition that can follow. Now, what you're about to see is a video that certainly could have been catastrophic. Luckily, this is a carrier who had made an investment in what could you have known, and they knew what happened and likely were able to drill into why it happened based on the information that was available through the program, video-based safety program that they had invested with. So, Lauren, could you go ahead and play that video for our audience? Thank you, Lauren. And this was a situation whereby, and we talk about, in this case, autonomous emergency braking, collision mitigation, the technology that the company had invested in actually took control of the vehicle when the driver was asleep and stopped what could have been a catastrophic rear-end collision. And through the visibility gained through the video-based safety initiative that they had, they can see definitively what the root cause of the crash was, and they can take action on that to preclude a recurrence on a go-forward basis. So you get a feel for the importance of the investment and what it can do. You need to get back to the slides, Lauren. Here we go. Sorry about that, folks. So a couple of pragmatic things for you to think about in really the communications plan, regardless of the type of change that you're trying to affect within your organization. It may be the implementation of a technology. This is actually a derivative of a smart drive process that they have found that works very well. But it's important to have a communication plan. And we used to say in the military that no plan survives first contact. And in that context, you could say the plan itself is of limited value, but planning is essential. And it is through the planning that we do for communications and other things that we really create the ability to be agile in the implementation. And so kind of continuing on the example we talked about, a video-based safety program, this is a technology rollout. But I would draw your attention as you look at the very busy slide about the discussion about goals and why I talked before about the vision being important. And there are goals that are established within the organization that, if achieved, will achieve the organizational vision. And we set objectives that will achieve the goals. And then we identify the specific actions depending on your level within the organization that have to be taken. And there should be that thread of continuity between the actions that we take and the attainment of the vision that has been articulated. So this is just an example, and you can see the details that are associated there. But what you'll also pick up on is that the communication methodology, the methods in which we communicate are pretty significant. We use every means at our disposal, to communicate the positive aspects of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And when we think we've communicated enough, we need to redouble our efforts at communication. One of the other things that I've learned is the importance of including our drivers' families. And oftentimes we can send communication to the home, which often the significant other may be the first one to actually read it. so that they understand what we're doing and why, because I think it helps to reinforce with them. We talk about retention of our fleet, that we truly care about our drivers, and we know that families will care that we care. So we have to be very broad-based and comprehensive in our communication planning and execution. You know, we have to recognize that we all have tiered accountabilities across our company. We have to make sure that as part of the change management and leadership, that we've identified those sensors and that they're focused on tracking the progress toward the goals that we've set. Are we measuring the right things? Are we measuring what we measure because we can or because we need to? And are they the right things? And it's important as we think about being able to enhance our communication and to be able to celebrate success toward attainment, that we have both quantitative and qualitative metrics that we track and communicate. And we also, like any other system, have to make sure that we have a feedback loop so informed course corrections can be made quickly and seamlessly when necessary. And so we have to make sure that we ask the right questions, we provide clear and concise answers to the field as those questions come up as being part and parcel of our overall communication strategy, irrespective of where you happen to serve within the organization. This is a much kind of a simpler diagram and really kind of reinforces the driver messaging being critical. There are occasionally cynics among your fleet, so the ability to be able to address the thoughts that they may have in a positive and constructive way becomes very important. Be planful, communicate face-to-face whenever possible, and demonstrate confidence and passion in what you're doing. When you do have driver meetings, face-to-face is certainly better. Listen to their questions. There will be a war storytelling part, but they will ask questions. We don't want to marginalize those questions. We know, as I mentioned before, that they've probably filled in what they think the gaps are and what they haven't heard. So we have to address those things. And we have to test our message to make sure that the message that we're communicating, oftentimes leaders simply repeat what they said previously more frequently and a bit louder. And if the people didn't get it the first time, they may not get it the fifth time. But by asking our people to brief us back and explain the concept or the purpose of the change that we're talking about, we can correct any misperceptions that might take place. So providing honest and transparent answers to their questions is critical to the success or failure of whatever initiative you're contemplating. So the bottom line, no matter your message, we've talked about use a variety of communication methods, certainly email. Some people prefer that. Printed letters that go home can be very powerful. Posters, meetings, text, those types of things. Here we mentioned on the slide the importance to engage with families so that they know that we care. And leaders have to, I used to encourage leaders to begin every conversation with a safety message and end it. But that's the ideal situation. It doesn't really matter when during the conversation you address the importance of safety. But if safety is to be a core value within your organization, it's important that it really be included in every communication throughout the organization that we have. And going back and reiterating the importance of changing our organization's beliefs to embrace change, to actually get excited by the prospect of change as opposed to being intimidated by it. Embracing the mentality of changing before we have to, as opposed to a phrase that many of you have heard, that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's the credo of root guards in my experience. And it's important, I think, to really challenge yourself introspectively. And I believe in my heart that if the pace of change external to your organization exceeds the pace of change within your organization, you're in trouble. You're probably on a slippery slope to obsolescence, and you don't even know it. So I would challenge us to take on that very difficult challenge of creating a culture that embraces change, where we actually become uncomfortable in our comfort. I glossed over it earlier, but there's a book called Danger in the Comfort Zone. I believe the author's name is Judith Barnwick, and she articulates it very much better than I do. But the status quo is often the vivid that is most clear in our people's mind's eye. So we have to understand that it's natural for people to create comfort zones for themselves and to become almost passive aggressive at times and being root guards against whatever change you are attempting to implement within your organization. Understand why people have that aversion to change and to begin to change the culture within the organization such that people get excited by the prospect of change as opposed to intimidated by it. That is very easy for me to say. It's certainly not easy to do, but it can be done. I want to close. One of the things that I've experienced that often when we introduce change within our organization, if we introduce a new program, a new technology, there are always people who are quick to say, well, let me give you 5 reasons why that is probably a bad idea. Let me give you 10 reasons. If you persist in believing that it's a good idea, let me give you 10 reasons why it would be really hard. And there are always those naysayers, cynics, and hand-wringers who are going to lead with and argue for not only their limitations, but your organization's limitations. I try to ignore those messages and those people. And this picture, I found this picture a while back, and I thought it really could be used as a metaphor for any number of things. But can you imagine what people would have said to, if you will, the parents of this tree to say, don't plant your seed on the edge of a rock outcropping. You can't grow a tree there. It'll never work. How many times have you brought an idea forward and have essentially heard it'll never work, or we've tried it before? You know, and here's an example where Mother Nature created a beautiful tree when a lot of people would have said that that's not possible. So I would challenge all of us to, one, recognize that you can influence change within your company. You can influence the creation and leadership of the culture within your company, and in fact, you must. And if you give sanction to the negative and limiting beliefs that others will impose on you, it will negatively affect your potential. It'll negatively affect your performance, and we as an industry will not turn the corner to reverse the negative trend that I talked about at the beginning of the webinar. So with that, we covered a lot of ground talking about selling safety at various levels within the organization, the importance of being proactive when it comes to taking action. Don't wait to be told, and do the right things right, and we will have individually and collectively done what we could do to make our industry as safe as it can be. So Lauren, with that, I will turn it back over to you, and we can open it up for questions.
Don, thank you very much. We do have some time remaining, so we're going to go ahead and answer a few questions that came in during our presentation. So our first question that I've got for you is you mentioned transitioning from a behavior-based management focus to a belief-based leadership focus. We really have to focus on both, don't we?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And if I didn't make that point, just to put a finer point on it, I'm not suggesting that we don't continue to engage in behavior-based safety management. We must do that. We're obligated to do that, and we need to make sure that we have sensors out there so that we can know what the behaviors are and take corrective action, whether that be a commitment to excellence, whether that be a performance enhancement training event, if it's a skill or knowledge issue. We must do that. But the way to affect lasting and meaningful change is to begin to change the beliefs within our organization. And we do that by leading people. And if we can change the beliefs, we will have fewer behaviors that we have to address in behavior-based safety management. But the questioner is exactly right. We must do both. Oftentimes, carriers are very good at behavior-based safety management because it's what they have always done. But just ask people to kind of switch that paradigm in their mind and think about the beliefs that undergird the behaviors and make adjustments there. And oftentimes people will embrace organizational beliefs as their own because there's kind of a mentality that people say that they want to fit in and they want to do what the organization wants. So by all means, do both.
Wonderful, thank you. Another audience question we just got. So, how important is a driver reward program, including cash, incentives, etc.?
Driver recognition is critically important, and I mentioned one of my previous bosses. Another one of my bosses always challenged us to say, what's our attaboy or attagirl ratio to our aw shucks ratio? And to actually be conscious of that. And when you go home, I would challenge the group, when you go home every day, ask yourself, what was your attaboy or attagirl to aw shucks ratio? It should be 4 or 5 to 1, positive attaboy, attagirl to every one aw shucks. What you'll find, if you're being honest with yourself, if there's some safety managers on the line, is that you're precisely the opposite of that. I sometimes tongue-in-cheek, and I exaggerate to make the point, is there are some safety managers in our industry who I call black hat wearing, clipboard carrying people who walk around finding people doing things wrong and then tattle on them so that somebody can punish them for that behavior. I'm clearly tongue-in-cheek and I'm exaggerating there. What we have to make sure that we're looking for, and I actually wrote an affirmation for myself because I found tendencies my father used to say, no news is good news. If I'm not hollering at you, it means you're doing well. Well, that's wrong. He was wrong in that mentality. And I wrote an affirmation for myself is to find people doing things right every day and recognize them for it. And in so doing, you will begin to reinforce the behaviors that you want. I'll give you an anecdote of that. I recognized when I was at Schneider that we had a very, very high percentage of our drivers who just did everything right. They were safe. They delivered on time. They just did everything right. They were the ones that were flying below the radar. And so I started drafting a quarterly letter that we sent home saying, thank you for your performance and thank you for being a role model for our company and setting an example for all of our drivers to follow in your professionalism. And of course, I recognized that the first one to read the letter was probably going to be the significant other. And you'd say to yourself, well, that's getting a letter from Don Osterberg. Does that really mean a lot to drivers? I'll tell you, I can't tell you how many drivers came to me and said, I got that letter that you sent me and I really appreciate that. And after that, I didn't draft the letter every quarter. I would have one of the business presidents or the CEO actually sign the letter that went out. But it was a very popular program. So recognition is important. Generally, in my experience, and no driver's going to want to hear this because they'll negotiate with cash as being the most desirable recognition, it's probably not the number one tool of recognition. But don't underestimate just the power of saying thank you and recognizing. I used to hold myself accountable to send at least 10 attaboy messages or attagirl messages every week. And if on Friday afternoon I hadn't sent 10 messages out, that was back when I actually knew how to send a message through our in-cab communication technology. Before I left on Friday, I would send out messages to drivers who had just gone above and beyond, and the response was tremendous. From that. So I absolutely encourage, and that's one of the beauties of video-based safety is that you can identify those positive behaviors that drivers take every day and recognize them for it, and it will have an exponential impact on the overall attitude of the fleet.
Wonderful, thank you.
What else?
Another question we just got. So do you get worried of becoming white noise on too many of the same messages?
I don't think so. The one thing you have to make sure is that, and it can happen. One of the things that I see when I go visit carriers is they'll have, a poster board up, and it isn't kept up to date. And one of the things that I like is you have to keep the message fresh, and you have to re-communicate often. But when you identify, especially when you're talking about change leadership, of a program, a technology, one that could potentially be viewed as intrusive, is to really over-communicate not only the what, but the why, and so that people can understand and embrace. And redundancy is the best teacher in that regard. So, I think there are instances where, your screensaver comes on and your core values are listed and nobody looks at it, but it's there. And it's a constant reminder to people about the core values of the organization. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about too much communication. I would be far more concerned with the converse of that, which would be under-communicating, especially when it comes to changes within the organization. Because let's face it, people loathe uncertainty, and change often brings uncertainty for people, and they look to us as leaders to create certainty for them out of uncertainty. So in that regard, over-communicating is the order of the day.
That's some wonderful advice. Another question we just got in. So how would you address the resistance by others in an organization in developing and cultivating a safety culture when one has never existed?
Well, it's a significant challenge. It really comes down to the organizational beliefs. And there are carriers out there whose, if the truth were to be known, would probably be, it's really productivity first and always. And if productivity is the proxy for profitability, or it's service first and always. What is happening right now, when looked at through a safety lens, is insanity. With what the consumer demands, and retailers especially have chosen to differentiate their offering based on service levels. We as a society are demanding next day delivery when we don't need it next day. We have retailers who are advertising free shipping. Well, it can't be free. There's no way that shipping can be free. And when we say that it is, we've effectively marginalized the importance of transportation in the supply chain, which we don't want to do. So in order to be able to create that safety culture, you, in that case, have to change your organizational beliefs. You have to anchor on what I mentioned before, is that while what we do is important, and we are clearly in business to make money, and service is a differentiator, nothing we do is worth harming ourselves or others. And if you believe that it's unacceptable that 13 people will die today in a truck-involved crash, and of those 13 who die, 2 of those are likely to be the commercial driver themselves. If you believe that's unacceptable, then you have to, through influence, inculcate that belief throughout the organization. And what it requires for a lot of the people that are on the phone is you have to lead up. And you have to ask the probing questions like I did during the slides today. What percentage of our total safety and risk spend is on prevention versus claim settlement? And when the executive then asks that question and realizes the answer to that question, you say, well, that's not right. And what we're trying to inculcate is this mentality of let's do the right things right, and we'll play on people's emotion as necessary. One of the things that I think works, and I mentioned it briefly about exposing ourselves to emotions, is an empathic program. And if you're involved in a serious injury or a fatality crash, reach out to the family and ask whether or not someone from your organization can attend the funeral or visit the individual person in the hospital. And now your lawyers will tell you not to do that. But in my experience, and a lot of times the family who you ask that of will say, no, I don't want you to be there. And I always understood that. But I will tell you, this hardcore airborne ranger cried with too many families who had been emotionally devastated by the loss of a loved one, and actually seeing and feeling the emotions associated with that loss, I think will change people's mind about where safety fits as a core value as opposed to a situational priority. So forgive me, I've touched my own emotional card there, but I think it's important in this case that if you're really trying to build a safety culture from scratch where one hasn't existed as the question suggested, you've got to ask the right questions and plant the seed to change the beliefs of the organization, and your behaviors will follow.
Don, we appreciate you opening up with that. We've got a few more questions, and again, out there, if you guys have any questions, we are still accepting them. Another one we've got from our audience. So it's easy to say we should be uncomfortable when we're in a comfort zone. How do you create a culture that is excited by change rather than intimidated by it?
Well, that is the challenge. And as I think I mentioned, I glossed over perhaps the slide, but change is unnatural, and embracing change is somewhat unnatural for people. And so it's important that we communicate the fact, and I mentioned before very briefly that if the pace of change external to your organization exceeds the pace of change within your organization, you're in trouble. And let's face it, things are changing pretty rapidly external to our organizations. So we have to be critical. Are we staying ahead of the power curve? Have we embraced innovation such that we actually can lead and not follow? I think it makes it easier then to create a mindset with our people that in order to stave off obsolescence, we have to be innovative, we have to embrace change, and you should be uncomfortable when you don't see things changing around us. Colin Powell, who was a mentor of mine many years ago, used to say that great leaders are normally great disorganizers, or a word to that effect. Now that sounds, you say, wait, you know what? But why would he say that? Is that it's a dialectic process associated with change. As we throw our organization out of order, and as we reassimilate back into order, we actually get better. It's a dialectic process. It's an out of order, into order dialectic. And so sometimes as leaders, we have to throw our organization out of order. And in so doing, we can get people to see the benefits as we create order within the organization. We've actually made ourselves better. And if you can make that part of their beliefs, they will be more apt to not resist change that you're advocating for, but embrace it. So again, easier to say than it is to do, but it can be done.
Appreciate that. I've got another one for you. So you challenged us to calculate what percentage of our safety and risk spend is on prevention and what percentage is for claim settlement when we fail. How do you calculate that?
Well, there's a number of variables that are going to go into that. Some of them are relatively easy. If you've made an investment in a safety technology, as an example, you know, and your accountants will know within a nickel of what you spent on that safety program intervention. So there are some things that you can include in there if you're investing in collision mitigation or video-based safety or lane departure warning or whatever the case may be as it relates to in-cab technology. A couple of them that are a little more difficult is, for example, what percentage of your driver leader's time, whatever your naming protocol may be for a driver leader, what percentage of their time are they spending on safety? And the best way to do that is to actually do sit-ins with them and do some check sheeting of what they talk with drivers about. But you're going to have to make some assumptions. You know, you may say that a driver leader, 20% of their time is spent with safety, either doing post-crash investigations or driver counseling on behavior, whatever the case may be, 20, 30%, whatever you think it is, and then, you know, use 20% of their salary, including benefits, as the plug cost there. So just think about the whole of what people do in your organization and try to capture those costs and add them up. And then the other thing that's easy is your claim settlement and insurance premiums. Those are plug numbers that you likely already have, and you just plug those in, and you'll be able to determine what percentage you're at. I can almost promise you that when you ask yourself that question before you begin to do the research and the actual calculations, you will assume that you're spending more on prevention than you are. My observation has been that as an industry, we have underspent in the area of technology. Now, I've been accused in the past of never seeing the technology I didn't like, and then that's patently unfair. But there are technologies today that are ready for prime time. And people engage in creative procrastination, essentially saying, well, the next generation of technology is going to be better. Well, no kidding. Of course it's going to be better. But at some point, these technologies are good enough today to buy in, and then you become the beneficiary of any changes and improvements in those technologies over time. So I would just challenge people, don't creatively procrastinate. Look for the technologies that are good enough go through the math exercise of calculating your percent of spend, and I think you'll agree, given the moral imperative and the financial imperative, that we're obligated to do more in the area of prevention. So that's a little bit outside of what the specific question was, but hopefully in that meandering answer, I got to the point of the question.
No, you did, and thanks for those tips. So I've got one more from our audience that's pretty topical to our current times. How do you keep safety top of mind in current times with FMCSA laxing rules on ELDs to support supply chain demands?
You know, it's so difficult. I don't, and I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. I don't, if you really believe, remember I talked about the importance of beliefs, if you really believe that public safety is job one, what they have to have concluded is that the risk of not being able to deliver needed products on time is greater than the risk associated with fatigue. I don't happen to embrace that mentality. I do believe that fatigue, contrary to what DOT's data would say, is likely the number one root cause of most high severity truck involved crashes. So I don't understand the rationale necessarily behind that, but those who have engaged in it obviously have concluded that the importance of delivering those products is more important than the risk of a fatigue-related crash. And it's a calculated judgment on their part, and it's probably not fair of me to suggest that they're wrong, but I just don't, I don't believe that where we're at right now relative to truck-involved fatalities and injuries are acceptable. And we can ill afford to soften regulations like hours of service in order to enable other priorities for the country. But that's just my personal opinion.
Well, thanks for that opinion. And right now, that is all of the time that we have for today. But for anyone who asked a question that wasn't answered, Smart Drive will be following up via email to answer your questions individually. We hope you all enjoyed today's webinar. I know I did. I want to thank Dawn again for today's presentation. I also want to mention that an on-demand version of this webinar will be available on the Trucking Info and Work Truck websites at either truckinginfo.com/webinars or worktruckonline.com/webinars. Thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.